Chapter 1. Sha'Vesh'Naak, Falling from the Sky. The last time Vor'Thak saw Thra'Kuun, its dying sun was the size of a claw tip, held at arm's length, a red pinprick shrinking in the viewport of a stolen ship, and with it, everything he had been. Warrior, hunter, sun, all of it rendered down to a single bright point that dimmed as he watched, as though the universe itself were closing an eye. He did not look away until it vanished entirely. That much, at least, he owed the homeworld that had cast him out. Then the klaxons began, and sentiment became a luxury he could no longer afford. 3 pursuit ships burned hard on his position. His Chagall implant, the tactical ocular that turned his left eye into a targeting computer, overlaid their signatures across his vision in hot amber. The Crawshall, the Vor'Thak, and the Thunar, crew-vesh hunters. Elite, fast, armed with plasma lances that could shear through hull plating the way a claw parts fur. The Nakvesh, the frigate he'd stolen and renamed after the old hunter's terrain sense, with the kind of black humor exile encouraged, was not fast, not elite, and not particularly armed. What it was, primarily, was failing. Reactor at 32%, the ship's synthetic voice reported. Hull breaches on decks 3 and 5. Shield integrity 14%. Hyperdrive offline. Recommendation, surrender and await mercy. Skip the recommendation. Current survival probability, if continuing evasion, 0.3%. Better than the probability if I surrender. Mathematically, no. But I sense you are not in a mathematical frame of mind. A plasma lance carved past the viewport, close enough that the superheated particles left after images on his retina and painted his fur with shifting crimson light. The ship shuddered as a secondary impact clipped the aft stabilizer. Vor'Thak's burned stripes, the bioluminescent markings that should have betrayed his emotions to anyone who looked, remained dark, dead black against midnight fur. The exile brand had burned them out, scarred the tissue that produced the light, and in doing so had given him the one advantage no other Markai possessed: a face that could not be read. No fear, no rage, no flicker of what moved beneath. The irony was not lost on him. They'd meant to mark him as an outcast. Instead, they'd made him invisible. Calculate a blind hyperspace jump, he said. Maximum distance. The navigation computer processed the request. A blind jump without navigational lock will destroy the navigation systems. The reactor may not survive containment. Probability of arriving anywhere habitable, negligible. Probability you will regret this decision, effectively certain. Understood. Emergency protocol engaged. Jump, he said, jumping. May your god have better judgment than you do. Vor'Thak keyed the sequence, his core film nodes, the chain of bioelectric clusters running along his spine. 17 of them, more than almost any Markai alive, ignited with the familiar white-hot pain that accompanied every use of the Vor'Thak. The exile brand had done something to the nodes as well. Overcharged them, burned out whatever regulators kept the power manageable. Every time he drew on that ancient energy, it came wrapped in lightning. He gripped the command throne as the jump drive engaged. Reality split open and the Nakvesh fell through. Hyperspace, as Vor'Thak had caused to reflect during the 17 seconds of conscious thought he managed before the ship began coming apart, was not designed for blind entry. The navigational lock existed for a reason. Several reasons, in fact. Each of them involving the various creative ways that unguided, faster-than-light travel could transform a ship and its occupants into something the universe no longer recognized. Colors that had no names filled the viewport. The hull groaned, deep, Structural, the sound of a vessel being asked to do something its designers had specifically warned against. Somewhere aft, an explosion sent tremors through the deck plating. The reactor's whine climbed octaves, past alarm and into the register that preceded catastrophe. His Ch'Gal implant fractured. The cybernetic glow in his left eye died, and the sudden loss of tactical overlay was like going half blind, which functionally it was. Pain spiked through his skull. He blinked, and the biological eye adjusted slowly, reluctantly, filling the space the implant had occupied. The ship bucked. Hull plates sheared away, through the widening gaps in the structure. Hyperspace pressed in. Not the orderly tunnel of a guided jump, but a maelstrom of compressed dimensions that looked to the naked eye like the universe having a seizure. 15 seconds. The reactor hit critical. The emergency containment system, to its considerable credit, held, channeling the cascade through the ventral plating rather than letting it vaporize the ship outright. The blast still hurled Vor'Thak through his restraints and into the rear bulkhead. His head cracked against ceramic, ribs compressed against the impact in ways that sent very specific signals about the number of them that had just broken. He had time to note, with a clarity that trauma sometimes grants, that the ground rushing up through the remains of the viewport was a plane of volcanic glass, and that it was reflecting the light of a red dwarf sun, and that both of these facts were going to become immediately and personally relevant. Then the Nakvesh hit the planet's atmosphere, and everything became fire. The Nakvesh hit atmosphere at an angle the engineers had never planned for, and the physics had no patience for. The heat shield, already compromised, failed in sections, peeling away from the hull like skin from a burn. Through the widening gaps, atmospheric friction painted everything in orange and white, and the sound was not a sound anymore but a presence, a living wall of noise that occupied every frequency simultaneously. Impact. Not the single event the word implies. A sequence. The belly of the ship struck the volcanic glass at an oblique angle, and the glass shattered beneath it, and the ship bounced, which was the kind of thing that only happens when the forces involved are large enough to make solid objects behave like skipping stones. The second impact was worse. The third was the one that mattered. The hull cracked lengthwise. The Nakvesh split open the way a seed pod splits, structurally with finality, and the two halves slewed apart across the obsidian plane in different directions, trailing fire and debris and the particular sound of a machine dying by degrees. Vor'Thak's half, the forward section containing the bridge, gouged a trench a quarter-mile long in the volcanic glass before friction and gravity and the plain collective outrage of physics brought it to a stop. Silence, not silence. The absence of the catastrophic noise that had preceded it, which felt like silence the way dawn feels, like cold after a fire. The hull ticked as it cooled. Metal settled into its new broken geometry with small groans and pops, like a body easing into a position it didn't choose. Smoke rose in thin columns through the gaps in the structure, carrying the smell of melted wiring and burned ceramic, and something organic that was probably his own fur. Through the shattered viewport, the alien sky stared in, red, vast, indifferent. Vor'Thak hung in his restraints, and the restraints were the only reason he hadn't followed the navigation console through the viewport, because the navigation console was now 30 meters away on the obsidian plane, and it had not survived the relocation. Blood dripped from his forehead onto the armrest. His own blood. The dark crimson of Mark high hemoglobin, almost black, slow and steady. The kind of bleeding that comes from a wound the body has decided is serious, but not immediately fatal, which was the body's way of saying, deal with this eventually, in the language of biology. He tried to move. His body declined. He tried again, with the particular stubbornness of someone who had been told no by larger forces than his own nervous system and had developed a policy of selective deafness toward the word. His right hand closed around the restraint release, squeezed. The mechanism, to its credit, still worked. He dropped forward out of the harness and onto the deck, and the deck was hot enough to feel through his armor, and the impact redistributed his pain in ways that suggested his injuries had been waiting for this moment to introduce themselves properly. He lay there, breathing, each breath a negotiation between his lungs and his ribs, the lungs wanting air and the ribs wanting to be left alone, and neither willing to compromise. Outside the ship, something shrieked, high-pitched, distant, curious. The first sound on this world that wasn't the ship dying. Something had heard the crash. Something was already interested. Consciousness returned poorly. It came in fragments, light, then dark, then pain, then a brief interval of something that might have been peace before the pain reasserted itself with renewed conviction. Vor'Thak's right eye opened. His left, the one that had housed the Sha'Gul, offered a stuttering overlay of corrupted data before settling into something approximately functional. He was alive, which meant that 0.3% had come through after all. He supposed he should be grateful. His ribs, of which several were now definitely broken, suggested that gratitude might be premature. The bridge was a ruin. Twisted metal, shattered consoles leaking sparks, the viewport replaced by a jagged opening through which alien air pushed in, humid, warm, tasting of copper and something organic that his predator's nose cataloged as rotting meat, territorial musk, acidic compounds, unknown, spore presence. The smell of a world that was very much alive and very much not interested in his welfare. A support beam had him pinned. His right arm was free. His left was trapped, and when he tried to move it, the grinding sensation confirmed what the rest of his body was already reporting. The damage was extensive, the resources were minimal, and the situation, considered objectively, was poor. He found the Vor'Thak first, his father's plasma shotgun, 3 feet away, half buried in debris. The obsidian black ceramic was scorched but intact. The glyphs he'd burned off the barrel after the exile, erasing his family's marks rather than shaming them by association, were visible as faint scars. 8 shot in the power cell. The weapon had survived atmospheric entry, which was more than could be said for most of the ship. The Greynack blades were still on his back. He felt their weight, their familiar presence against his spine. Twin fiber blades, ancestral weapons, older than the current council and considerably more reliable. He channeled the Vor'Thak to free himself. The nodes along his spine lit up. 17 points of grinding fire and bioelectric energy flooded his muscles with borrowed strength. He gripped the support beam, lifted, and his left arm came free, with a rush of returning sensation that was approximately as pleasant as the initial trapping had been. The beam clanged to the deck. Vor'Thak lay on the ruined bridge, breathing in shallow pulls that his ribs would tolerate, and took stock. Broken bones. Burns. A concussion that made the world pulse slightly with each heartbeat. A leg that would bear weight, but not happily. A cracked implant, a dead ship, no supplies to speak of, and a planet he knew nothing about except that it smelled like something that ate things. He pulled himself upright using the Vor'Thak as a crutch and limped to the viewport's edge and looked out at the world that had caught him. It was, in its way, magnificent. Blood-red sky stretching to the horizon, not with the warmth of sunset, but with the permanent, weary light of a star that had been dying for longer than most civilizations lasted. The color of everything, sky, ground, the distant tree line, sat in the range between fresh wound and old scab, as though the entire planet had been designed by someone with a limited palate and a taste for the dramatic. Before him spread a vast plain of volcanic glass, shattered and reformed by ancient impacts into a surface that caught the red light and broke it into fragments. The scar plains, if he'd had access to the pre-landing scans his dead navigation system had once contained, obsidian mirrors stretching to the horizon, beautiful in the way that a field of knives is beautiful, which is to say, best appreciated from a distance. Beyond the plains, rising like fortress walls, jungle, dense, bioluminescent vegetation, glowing faint violet and sickly yellow against the omnipresent red, fungal spires, towering higher than the ship's wreckage, the canopy, a living ceiling that hid whatever lived beneath it. Wind through the viewport carried the full symphony of the planet's scent profile. Ozone, sulfur, rotting organic matter, and beneath it all, the musk of territorial predators, multiple species, layered, some fresh and some old, all of them saying the same thing in their respective biochemical languages. This is ours. Stay away or be consumed. Sounds, distant but distinct. A high-pitched shriek that echoed off the glass plains. A deeper answering roar that Vor'Thak felt in his sternum. And underneath both, a low thrumming that seemed to come from the ground itself, rhythmic and organic, as though the planet had a heartbeat. He spent 20 minutes. He couldn't afford exploring the crash site, because leaving without knowing what he had was the kind of decision that killed people on day 2 instead of day 1. The Naklesh's aft section lay 300 meters southeast, a dark shape against the glass like a beached predator. Between the two halves, a debris field of scattered components, hull fragments, ruptured conduits, the personal effects of a ship that had once carried a crew of 37 and now carried nothing but ruin. He saw a boot wedged under a panel and looked away. The crew had been reassigned before his trial. The boot was old. It didn't mean anything. It meant something. He moved on. The gravity made everything harder. Each step carried weight that Thra'Kuun's pull never imposed, a persistent downward insistence that turned walking into labor and labor into negotiation. His body, evolved for standard gravity, registered the difference in every joint. His damaged knee, which had been merely painful at 1.0, became a structural liability at 1.3. He compensated by shifting weight to his good leg and accepting the asymmetry, adding another entry to the growing catalog of ways this planet intended to make his life specifically and personally difficult. The air was the other problem. Thick enough to taste, loaded with spores that tickled his throat and made his lungs work harder than they wanted to. He coughed, tasted copper, and decided that the atmospheric composition was breathable in the same way that the crash had been survivable, technically with reservations, and only if one's standards had been recently and dramatically lowered. He catalogued what the crash had left him. The Vor'Thak 8 shots. The Gra'nak blades fully charged, which was something. His armor, scorched, cracked in the chest plate, but holding. The Sha'Gal implant, intermittent, stuttering data across his left eye in fragments that were more confusing than useful. Medical supplies, whatever the emergency locker contained, if the locker had survived. Rations unknown. Water none. The list was not encouraging. He filed it alongside every other discouraging thing this day had produced and continued walking. His mother, who had possessed a gift for finding the worst in any situation and making it sound philosophical, would have said something like, "Well, Vor'Thak, you wanted to be somewhere the council couldn't find you. Congratulations." He drew one of his Gra'nak blades. The vibro blade activated with a hum that he'd been hearing since he was old enough to hold a weapon. Plasma coils igniting along the cutting edge, blood-red glow matching the world around him as though the blade had dressed for the occasion. "Grey Thakvor," he said to the alien sky, and the prayer came out of him before he could decide whether he still believed in the god it addressed. "The scrolls teach that you judge warriors by their deaths. If this world is your judgment, then hear me. I will not die easily. I will not die for their lies." He paused, considered, and if you're not listening, which, given recent events, seems increasingly likely, then I'm talking to an alien sky, which is still more productive than talking to the Council. He stepped out of the wreckage onto Ch.1. The volcanic glass crunched beneath his boots. The gravity was heavier than standard, perhaps 1.3 times, enough to make his injuries announce themselves with fresh enthusiasm. The air was thick, humid, and tasted of ash and copper with every breath. Behind him, the Nakvish smoldered in the crater of its own making, half a mile of scorched earth and scattered debris marking his arrival on a world that had not invited him and did not appear inclined toward hospitality. Ahead, the jungle waited. The distant predator calls had fallen silent, which any hunter knew was worse than noise. Silence meant something was listening, watching, making decisions about the new arrival. Vor'Thak limped forward, plasma shotgun in one hand, vibroblade in the other, broken and burning and very much alone on a world that killed things for a living. Behind him, the ship died by degrees. The last plasma conduit sighing out, emergency lights flickering their final rhythm, the synthetic voice that had mocked him through the jump, making no further observations about the quality of his decisions. In the silence, the death world breathed, and Vor'Thak the Oathless, exiled hunter, branded traitor, limped toward the tree line with the grim understanding that the universe had presented him with two options, survive or don't, and that both of them started with the same first step. He took it. The distance to the tree line was longer than it looked. Distances on Ch.1 had a quality of deception, the red light and the flat glass playing tricks with depth perception, stretching what should have been 500 meters into something that felt like a kilometer. Or perhaps his injuries were doing the stretching. Hard to tell. The distinction between objective distance and subjective suffering had become blurred. He walked. One foot, then the other. The rhythm of a body doing the only thing left available to it. The volcanic glass crunched and sang beneath his boots, a musical tinkling that would have been pleasant in any context that didn't involve a death world and a hunter held together by determination and the remnants of military-grade armor. Halfway to the tree line, his leg buckled. Not gradually, not with warning. The knee simply stopped being a knee and became a hinge that operated in directions hinges should not. And he hit the glass hard enough to cut his palms through his gauntlets, and the impact traveled through his broken ribs with a specificity that made him gasp. He lay on the volcanic glass, face down, breathing against the ground. The surface was warm from the red sun, and through the cracks in it, tiny bioluminescent organisms pulsed in slow rhythms, blue-green, the first gentle thing he'd seen on this planet. "Get up," the voice in his head was his father's. Not a memory. Something older, deeper, encoded in the muscle and bone of a warrior's upbringing. Markai children learned to stand before they learned to speak. Falling was tolerated. Staying down was not. Get up. He got up. His knee screamed. He ignored it, the way he'd been ignoring things since the crash, which was becoming a comprehensive life philosophy. Identify the unbearable thing, acknowledge its existence, and then proceed as though it didn't matter, because it didn't, because the only thing that mattered was the next step. The tree line resolved from a dark mass into individual shapes. Massive fungal stalks, 30 meters tall. Their surfaces rippled with bioluminescent veins that pulsed slowly in colors that had no names. Leaves the size of his body, thick and waxy, hanging motionless in the heavy air. Root systems erupting from the ground like architecture, twisted and gnarled, creating hollows and arches and the suggestion of shelter. And sounds. The jungle was not quiet. It hummed, it clicked, it wrestled with movements that could have been wind or could have been things that moved like wind to disguise their approach. Something called from deep in the canopy, a three-note sequence rising that was answered by silence. Something else snapped a branch, deliberately, the way a warning is delivered, and the cracks split the air and scattered birds from 3 canopies away. Vor'Thak stopped at the edge, the glass plane behind him, open and exposed and offering no cover. The jungle ahead, dense and alive and offering the kind of cover that came with things hiding in it. Neither option was good. The glass would leave him exposed to anything airborne. The jungle would put him in the territory of whatever was making those sounds. He chose the jungle. Not because it was safer. Because it was what a hunter would choose, and if he stopped being a hunter, he stopped being anything at all. He stepped off the glass and onto soil for the first time. Soft. Dark. Rich with the smell of decay and growth happening simultaneously, the biological process of a world consuming itself and being reborn from the remains. His boots sank an inch. The gravity pushed him down. The jungle pressed in from every side. The bioluminescent glow of the fungi cast long, rippling shadows that moved even when nothing visible was moving. The air was thicker here, warmer, and every breath carried spores that sparkled briefly in the light before dissolving against his fur. He found a hollow between 2 massive root systems, large enough for 1 markai, defensible on 3 sides with a sightline back toward the glass plane. He wedged himself in, drew the Vor'Thak across his lap, held a Gra'nak blade in his free hand. The red sky dimmed, not sunset, not in the way Thra'Kuun's sky had dimmed with color and ceremony, just a gradual deepening, the dying star admitting that even its diminished light had limits, and the darkness arriving not as an event but as a continuation, the natural state of a universe that merely tolerated brightness. The jungle responded. Bioluminescence intensified as the sky darkened, the fungi blazing brighter, the undergrowth coming alive with pinpricks of color. Blue, green, a deep pulsing red that matched the fading sky. The canopy above became a second sky, one made of living light, shifting and responding to movements he couldn't see. Beautiful, in the way that all lethal things are beautiful. A sound reached him from deep in the canopy. Not the calls he had cataloged over the last hours, the clicks and whistles and 3-note sequences of creatures going about their nocturnal business. Something new, low, rhythmic, a grinding, tearing sound, like something very large slowly pulling apart something that had been very solid. His Sha'Vesh'Naak hummed, not the sharp spike of immediate danger, but the low, sustained vibration of proximity to something that occupied a higher position in the food chain than anything else nearby. The biological equivalent of a weather warning, not a storm, but the conditions that make storms possible. He tightened his grip on the Vor'Thak. 8 shots, each one a small island of certainty in an ocean of things he did not understand. He had been a warrior his entire adult life. He had killed things that the Council considered unkillable. He had commanded warships and survived battles that the tactical analysts had declared unwinnable. None of that prepared him for the specific terror of a first night on an alien world, surrounded by organisms whose capabilities he could not assess, in a jungle whose rules he had not yet learned, armed with failing weapons and a body that was compiling new damage reports by the hour. The grinding sound stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left, and the silence was worse, because silence meant the thing had finished what it was doing, and finished things looked for new things to do. He sat in his hollow, bleeding and broken and armed, and watched the death world transform itself into something that would have taken his breath away if his breath hadn't already been claimed by his ribs. The first night on Thra'Kuun began. He did not sleep.